Welcome all of you panelists and public to the latest Alborada online talk. Today we're going to be discussing the Latin American left and constitutional change. As many of you will know, Alborada focuses on providing a progressive take on media, culture and politics in the region, and more information on Alborada's upcoming events and other activities will be posted in the chat during today's discussion. My name is Victor Figueroa Clark. I'm going to be your host this evening. I'm an Alborada contributing editor and someone who's studied Latin America for many years. We've got a great session lined up for you today. 3 panelists. We have Olivia Arrego Stiles, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Essex, who's working on indigenous politics in 20th century Bolivia, and who's a fellow contributing editor here at Alborada. She'll be discussing Bolivia. We have Dr. Lina Malagon, who's a research associate at the University of Ulster, and whose career has balanced scholarship with work as a researcher, a litigant, and an advocate in conflict-affected and post-conflict countries, working with victims, civil society organizations, and international organizations for many years. And she'll be speaking on Colombia. And we have Hector Rios Jara, who is a PhD candidate in social science at University College London, and who is a member of Social Theory and Latin American Thought, CLACSO, and the Chilean London Assembly, and he will be speaking on Chile. Each speaker is going to have about 8 to 10 minutes to talk, and then at the end we will turn to a Q&A for which we'll have about 30 minutes. Please put any questions that you may have in the general chat, or if you prefer, you can message Alborada questions directly, indicating, if you can, whether you would like to read your question out or not, and we will make sure that you have the opportunity to do that. Today's topic is an interesting one, and funnily enough, it's a recurring theme in Latin America, because this is a region that is famous, or perhaps infamous, for its constitutional processes. There have been 195 constitutions in just 18 countries since 1810, which is many times more than comparative regions such as Europe. And this is because constitutions are important. As we know, they are rule books for social, political, and economic interaction. They are statements of vision, statements of values and of intent. They are, to some degree, lists of priorities that a society sets out for itself. And they play a key role as legitimizing documents, nation-building moments, and in the consolidation of power. But they're also notorious for the gap that can exist between what's on paper and what actually happens in the implementation. And this is, of course, linked to the ability to enforce many of those aspirations. But it's also because constitutions are often the product of compromise, and therefore they reflect a balance of power at a given moment in time. But because situations and social situations in particular are in constant change, this means that constitutions can rapidly become outdated and become shackles on social, economic, and political development. Constitutions can also reflect fashions and dominant concepts. So, for example, many constitutions articulate the separation of powers or the autonomy of central banks. But left-wing constitutions should surely be counter-hegemonic, and in the past have privileged socioeconomic and collective rights over perhaps individual and political rights, or perhaps rather they have seen individual and political rights through the prism of socioeconomic and collective ones. And we can see this in constitutions of the old socialist states. In Latin America today, it's interesting to see how these counter-hegemonic ideas are being evoked in constitutions such as those of Cuba, Nicaragua, or Bolivia, where they evoke ancestral struggles against colonialism and imperialism, and where we're also seeing the introduction of indigenous categories into the constitutions of today. But regardless of political orientation, constitutions have to answer some key questions. Who or what is the nation? What is this imagined community? Who's part of it and who isn't? The structure, the purpose, of institutions, the roles and of these institutions, and the priorities that the state lays out for itself. For example, in Bolivia today, the state states that healthcare is a priority, whereas in Chile, it is national security. And this reflects that issue of constitutions being an expression of a moment in time, but it's also part of a reality that constitutions need to defend a particular social structure. And the question for the left is, whose is that structure? And how does it fit into an international reality? And related to this, all constitutions have to deal with certain challenges. They have to balance aspirations and reality, democracy and the efficacy of decision-making. And for the left, they either have to defend an existing socialist order, however, whatever its shortcomings may be, or they have to enable the transition towards one. And therefore they need to be flexible. And I think we have to ask the question whether there is a one-size-fits-all constitution that would fit a left-wing kind of framework. And so today we're going to touch on these and many other questions. What role should constitutional struggle play in left-wing politics? How has the Latin American left been able to shape the constitutions of the region today? And what are the outlines of the constitutions of tomorrow? So without further ado, let's see what our panelists say. First up, we have Olivia. Take it away, please.
Thanks. Thanks, Victor. And thank you for an amazing introduction as well. I think that really foregrounded some of the themes that hopefully we'll get into. So tonight I'm going to talk briefly about some of the major constitutional developments in Bolivia in recent years. And I'm going to try and centre left indigenous struggles as they relate to these constitutional projects. And I think, Victor, you gave an amazing introduction there about why constitutions matter, because I think that's a really, really important point, because at first glance, it might seem like an esoteric question, but I think it is super important to recognise the complicated role that constitutions have played and the political reality of constitutions have played in specifically Bolivian political life since independence, and especially for sectors with a conflictual relationship historically with the state. That is to say, indigenous peoples, the poor, workers, the labour movement, and so on. So I think, as Victor was saying, constitutions are very powerful instruments that shape political and social orders. And the US political scientist Bo Breslin put it in quite a nice way. He said, constitutions are documents that use words to create worlds. So I think going from that, I think we can see that Bolivia has witnessed three great constitutional upheavals. So we have the anti-colonial insurgency and the foundation of the Republic in 1825, in 1952, the National Revolution, and finally, what I'm kind of going to focus probably a bit more on today is 2009, the beginning of the plurinational era, coinciding also with the election of ex-President Evo Morales. There are some other key moments that many you might want to get into, but so the Constitutional Assembly of 1938, the Indian Congress of 1945, and perhaps also 1971, but I think we'll leave those for today, maybe. So I'm going to start by outlining the significance of 2009 and how we should understand also the coup of 2019 as shaped by those constitutional developments. So as part of a wave of new Latin American constitutionalism with constitutions in Ecuador in 2008, in 2009, Bolivia was refounded as a plurinational state. And this was the outcome of a Constituent Assembly directly elected in 2006, and with the constitution approved by voters in a historic referendum, the first of its kind, with a 64% approval and I think at least 90% turnout. And the sort of, from its outset, the constitution was presented, as Victor was kind of mentioning there, by Morales, by social forces who had been demanding it as part of a long historical struggle for the liberation of indigenous peoples and other excluded sectors. So in 2012, it's worth saying that 40% of Bolivia's population identified as a member of an indigenous people or nation. And In Bolivia, the constitution was demanded from below amid a cycle of anti-neoliberal protests between 2000 and 2003 by campesinos, by workers, by indigenous groups who were protesting neoliberal policies and eventually forcing the resignation of then President Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada in 2003. So the main demands of those protests were firstly the nationalization of hydrocarbons, but also the drafting of a new constitution. And this was sort of tied up with wider developments and with the election also in 2005 of Evo Morales and the ascent of the mass, the movement towards socialism. But the process of drafting the constitution was incredibly fractious. It was a product of compromise, as Victor mentioned, but you also saw hunger strikes, street violence, protests from opposition forces, including a massacre in 2008 of pro-Morales indigenous groups. So the constitution was an outcome, therefore, of a pluralistic popular process, and it saw the convergence of what we might say liberal representative democracy and also norms derived from radical traditions, from indigenous worldviews. So it brought together a number of disparate social sectors, including also within the indigenous movements, lowland indigenous groups, highland peasant indigenous groups, who had very different historical trajectories, very different political trajectories, and a very different relationship with the state. Including in that process, it was also the presence of opposition groups, elites, the traditional right-wing elites from the lowland areas. So how should we understand the significance of the constitution that emerged from this very sort of fractious process? I mean, I think it can be understood in two ways. I mean, as a response clearly to multiple crises of the state at that time. In the longer term, the enduring colonial character of the nation state, there was a rupture with the 19th century state designed by Creole elite architects of Latin American independence, a liberal state tied to the formation of racial capitalism and individualism, a state that continued to be defined by colonial modes of domination, even in the post-colonial era. And as the text of the constitution explicitly says, it aimed to render the colonial, republican, and neoliberal state in the past. So I think, yeah, it's probably also worth bringing in a bit of the genealogy in terms of, if we go back to 1825 and the settlement that emerged with independence, in many ways dramatically worsened the situation for indigenous peoples in the newly constituted state. It consolidated the power of a Spanish descendant oligarchy who controlled the mines and increasingly the land. And throughout the 19th century, and indeed well into the 20th century, we see escalating land grabs of indigenous communal land by landlords, by the burgeoning capitalist class. And this took place without any of the juridical protections that the colonial state had provided in some ways. So one of the curious and I think quite noteworthy elements of indigenous mobilization in the early 20th century, which is a focus of some of my research, is the use of colonial era titles and norms. And this is because the liberal order, the independence constitution, which sort of nominally treated indigenous communities as equals, implied the loss of indigenous, of legal protections and left communities vulnerable to an accelerating process of primitive accumulation and the loss of land. So if we fast forward to 2009, we can see the constitution that emerged as a product of that distinct constitutional genealogy. But it was also the product of short-term crises, the crisis of late 20th century neoliberalism, brutal austerity, privatization, the deep economic inequalities in 20th and early 20th century Bolivia. So in symbolic and rhetorical terms, I think the constitution clearly represents a departure from 20th century and 19th century state-led development initiatives and racial attitudes. So the national revolution in 1952 was highly transformative, providing for universal suffrage, for example. Prior to the revolution, only 3% of the population had the right to vote. as well as a package of other reforms, including agrarian reform, the nationalization of mines. I won't go into too much detail, but the gains of this revolution were quite quickly eroded as the MNL party capitulated to the US. But I think more importantly is that at the heart of this sort of project of state transformation at that time was an assimilationist drive that sought to transform Bolivia's Indian population into campesinos, to integrate them into a hegemonic mestizo Bolivian national identity. And this would be something that would be rejected in the 1970s by the indigenous campesino movement, and we can see that continuing into demands for a plurinational state from the 1980s, because these demands had been around a long time. And if you a reading of the Sesutsabe, the major peasant union federation, which was founded in 1979, a reading of their documents shows that the union was articulating demands for a plurinational state at least from the 80s. And this intensified in the 90s, the era of the so-called multicultural turn in Bolivia and Latin America. And I think that's quite important for looking at the kinds of language that we see emerging in the constitution, because there was a package of reforms in the 90s. In 1994, the Ley Participación Popular introduced a number of reforms relating to decentralization, which did have a major impact in terms of assisting with the rise of the indigenous movement, assisting with the rise of the mass as well. This is when they were formed. They started to win seats in the indigenous majority municipalities that were created as a result of this. But in general, this period has been sort of understood in general terms to be a kind of an example of window dressing, sort of ornamental reforms, sort of the language of indigenous rights without fundamentally altering the institutional makeup of the state. So that's the sort of backdrop to then where we get to in 2009. And I think the two key dimensions of the 2009 constitution really are sort of, firstly, the symbolic discursive decolonization of the state. And that's broadly commensurate with what started to emerge in the 90s. But there's also an institutional component. It sets out a state which is decentralized, founded on plurality, on linguistic, political, cultural pluralism. So we have 36 indigenous languages recognized by the state. We also have the recognition of communitarian democracy as a kind of an innovation. So this was envisaged as being exercised in self-governed indigenous campesino entities. And also the constitution provides for quotas, so a certain number of indigenous representatives in the Legislative Assembly and special indigenous electoral districts. But it also gave significant power to departmental governments. And this is significant when we think about the regional separatism that emerged particularly strongly and virulently in this period in the Media Luna region. So that's the lowland region of Bolivia. It's the heart of the agribusiness elites, the expansion of the agricultural frontier, the home basically of powerful right-wing business interests. And the current governor, Luis Fernando Camacho, was a governor of Santa Cruz. He was also a ringleader in the coup of 2019, for example. So I think, so there's clearly sort of dangers start to emerge in the settlement that sort of came out in the constitution, as well as other deeper sort of tensions, particularly regarding indigenous autonomies, proximity to the state, the tension particularly for lowland indigenous groups between kind of rejecting the state or seeking greater incorporation within its structures. I briefly mention that another sort of major concept to emerge, which is—
Sorry, Olivia.
Yep.
I hate to cut you off because it is what you're saying is very interesting, and I think some of the things you point to are issues that are going to be discussed in the other constitutions under review today. For example, the issue of decentralization and so on. But hopefully, we can come back to the things that you were hoping to discuss in the question and answer. My apologies. It's not something that, it's not a pleasant role, that of the chair. So, Lina, if you could please take us to Colombia now. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you so much for this invitation and introduction. Let me share my, something like, let me share my, if I can you see the PowerPoint? Great. Great, this presentation is about the Constituent Assembly, the Constitution, and the democratic opening in Colombia. Let me say that in the 90s, that is a process in the 90s, during the peace process between the Colombian government and the guerrilla group M19, M19, the guerrilla group continuously demanded a Constituent Assembly to reform the Constitution in order to facilitate the creation of political parties. That's the main objective they had in mind, in order to replace or to create more political parties. And the government at that point didn't accept the proposal for various reasons, but including that the large drug trafficking cartels wanted to take advantage to the process and include changes in the mechanism of extradition. And basically that was the debate at that point. Then in 1989, just a year before of the agreement, a group called the Seventh Ballot, La Séptima Papeleta, formed by students from various public and private universities, took up the idea and pushed for the March 1990 elections to include the options of supporting the organization of a National Constituent Assembly. In those elections, the option of, let me see, the options of supporting the organization of a National Constituent Assembly was just took. And in those elections, it was the idea was just to vote for candidates to the Congress and local authorities, and also to vote for the Constituent Assembly that will be the seventh ballot in the election. Although it wasn't an official request, it was an informal count in those elections, but registered more than 2 million ballots in favor of 7.6 million voters. Given the importance of these results, the Supreme Court endorsed a formal consultation in the following presidential elections on May same year. And in that consultation, the result was that 86% of the voters voted in favor. Then it was a very positive environment and a democratic moment for the renovation of the Constitution. Then by December 1990, we had a new Constituent Assembly. It was elected as well. And this election had 70 members of the Constituent Assembly. And if you see here, it's very interesting because not only the Liberal Party, that is 25 seats, the Movimiento de Salvación Nacional is a conservative party, the Partido Social Conservador is a conservative party, had 11 and 9, but we have, and the Christian Movement as well, is a very conservative political party at the moment, had 2. But if you see here, we had a really interesting new political parties. We had the M19, El M19 as a new political party, ex-guerrilla members, and two different political parties was the UP, La Unión Patriótica, it was the left-wing political party, plus the Movimientos Indígenas, the indigenous populations, the organizations that had 2 seats. And this is, you see the percentage is more or less the 33% of the seats were for progressive forces. And this is a big difference. Another important difference is that in order to promote peace negotiation with other guerrilla groups, the government gave the possibility of participation with voice, but no vote, for new additional representative of guerrilla members. two from the EPL, another two from different guerrilla groups. And it was a really interesting conformation of this assembly. What is important to say? It's important to say about the significant democratic changes that the Constitution gave us. We have this description that is like, in English, as like the democratic and social state subject to the rule of law. Then it's not only that the Colombia will be subject to the rule of law, to the normative framework, that it was more or less the same everywhere, but it's this vision that the state is social and is subject to the social demands. It implies the inclusion as an obligatory framework of socioeconomic rights. And it will be an enormous change for the life of Colombia since 1991. The second very important change is the inclusion of human rights framework. It means protection, promotion, and guarantee mechanisms and institutions for the promotion, for the protection, for the promotion, the guarantee of human rights. This is really, really important, in particular for a country like Colombia with a very long tradition of human rights violations. And the third thing that I like to say is many more, but I mean the openness or the recognition of collective rights for indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities. And this I will refer later a little bit more. And is this, in terms of the configuration of the state, the new constitution gave a political participation of indigenous and Afro communities in the Congress. And this is important for us. It was a really important change because established a permanent seat for these communities that were completely ignored, undermined for years and decades for the rest of life. And it was the first time that they had a permanent seat in this representative institution, part of the state. It has all the critics that you like to imagine, but the important thing was that it was the first mechanism to establish this guarantee. Other important things like mechanisms of political participation, referendum, public consultation, plebiscite, recall election, vote of no confidence, that for other democratic countries, they probably are very common. However, for Colombia was a very important moment to give a new life to these institutions. Some of them were good changes and other ones were quite, well, not very successful in the end. I think the creation of some institutions changed and played a significant role in ensuring that at least some of those responsible for committing human rights abuses are held to account. And it has been really crucial. The first was the Constitutional Court that plays a key role in ensuring that the human rights provisions enshrined in the Constitution are upheld. And definitely the Constitutional Court has had a really important and key role in establishing a change in the democratic life in Colombia. The Human Rights Ombudsman Office, which is forms part of the public ministry, it means independent of all the branches of the power, and is to oversee the promotion, exercise, and dissemination of human rights. The Office of the Procurator General is responsible for carrying out disciplinary investigations into the responsibility of public officials in human rights abuses, and for example, has imposed disciplinary sanctions against senior military officers implicated in human rights abuses. The Human Rights Unit of the Office of the Attorney General is responsible for criminal investigations and prosecutions for all those accused of human rights abuses, and has made important rulings on several emblematic and long-standing human rights cases. Let me say, just to finish this, as the important changes in terms of freedoms and rights. One is religious changes in the religion's freedom, gender equality. We can just go back to these topics later, but let me say, limits to states of exceptions. Colombia live in a permanent state of exception that it gave to the state, to the government, all the power to change all kind of norms all the time. And this is the limit, the end of this state of exceptions, and important mechanisms to protect and guarantee human rights. Writs of protection, class action, action popularis, other kind of actions for defending and promoting human rights. And I will refer later about the block of constitutionality, that is one particular view from the Constitutional Court to promote and protect human rights, and in particular constitutional rights. I will stop here for...
Thank you, Lina. Very interesting. And I think some of these mechanisms for change, the plebiscite, the recall, votes of no confidence, would have been quite useful for the Chilean constitution in the last couple of years. And on that note, let's sign to our final panelist,
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. It's nice to debate about constitution in Latin America, and of course, thinking in the strategic side of changing constitution. In Chile, of course, we're a little bit late, probably, of the pink tide, but also from an effort to build a democratic constitution. Today, I would like to give you a little bit of the update of what is going on with the process of the Constitutional Convention. Based on that, try to explain a little bit the debate within the left and the forces of transformation around the constitutional process. So, as maybe you already know, the convention starts the 4th of July of this year, and the convention is the result of 4 critical events. The first one is, of course, the social uprising of October 2019. The second one is the political agreement of the 14th of November, which is defining the institutional condition and route to change the constitution. The third one is the first referendum of October 25 of last year, when the people vote 78% in favor of changing the constitution. And of course, finally, the last election, when we decide the conventionals that happened during the 15th and 16th of May of this year. From that election, we have a progressive and anti-neoliberal forces dominating the majority of the seat in the convention. So from the 8th of July until today, we have around 2.5 months of the convention going on. During those first months, what happened is basically a debate around how we organize the convention. So what happened is the conventional decided to create 8 commissions about fundings, administration, communication, organization, human rights. The idea of those commissions was to define and propose the general rules of the convention. So those commissions basically call for public audiences, and they invite different actors of civil society to hear what people think about what kind of rule should be included in the convention. Based on that material, they debate and deliberate, and they finally propose some rules. So yesterday, convention approved the general proposal for the regulation of the convention that passed with a kind of significant majority. We still have some room for amendments until I think it's tomorrow. Based on that rule, we finally can start the discussion about the new constitution by itself. So a little bit of how the rules are organized, the constitutional debate in the future. The first thing that will happen is the conventional will divide in 7 commissions about different topics and angles of the constitution, one in political system, another one in constitutional principles, other about social rights, other about environment and the rights of nature, and so on. The debate will start from zero, so we don't have any previous background about, despite what the conventional decide, which is relevant. The conventional will have the initiative to propose. Those initiatives need to be discussed first in the commission and then in the plenary. And once all, when we have finally the plenary discussing those initiatives that receive a support of 2/3 of the approval of the conventional will consider as a valid and will be incorporated in the draft. So that is probably one of the main dilemmas that we have already in the convention. I don't know how much minutes I have. So sorry, how many minutes?
You have 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes, okay. So let's go to discuss a little bit of strategy. One of the key debates in the left right now is about the quorums. Of course, we have from the conservative and the government sector a campaign of to try to undermine the legitimacy of the convention that include different fake news, misleading information, even really offensive statements about the president, Elisa Loncon, and other important figures, for example, and Pikachu, which is a symbol as well of the convention. But in the side of the left, most of the debate is related to the quorum of decisions. Some sectors disagree with the quorum of 2/3 that I already explained. They argue 3 main reasons. The first one is it can be used as a brake to stop the transformation demand by people. The second one is that quorum was imposed by the forces of the establishment. And the third one is that the convention had by itself the right to self-determine if that quorum is right or not. From the side of the softer anti-neoliberal forces and more liberal, but still progressive sector of the convention, they think that it's necessary to keep the quorum. Why? Because the conventional process is weak and rely basically on democratic agreement. So they don't find wise to try to push a little bit further the convention. The other argument, which I found probably the most strategic one, is the fact that because we have already a progressive majority and the conservative forces did not reach 1/3 of the seat, there's no need to remove the quorum. That will be more problematic, can put in confrontation the convention with the parliament, for example, and could be much more dilemmas rather than solutions. But what is at the bottom of the debate are different models of democracy. The more moderate sectors are imagining and demanding a more representative and institutionalized way of democracy, while the emerging, the more hard anti-neoliberal sectors are pushing for a more participatory way of democracy. This is not about a strategy. There is not a huge disagreement. I think most of the forces are in favor of the constitution and try to combine, as most of the pink tech government did at the beginning, a strategy of mobilization and win electoral power and institutional representation. So the core debate is about how we recognize our differences and basically who is the subject of change that going to lead the process of transformation. Because unexpectedly, the left had the problem to interpret people's desires and the desires of the uprising. And just to finish, I'm going to give you an example. Most of the people, like me, for example, we were skeptical about the role of the convention by itself, but we ended up supporting it because the majority of people did. So I think if the left is having significant problem to understand people's desires, what kind of country they expected, and who are those who want to change it. The Constitution can offer the opportunity, of course, but we still need to include the way that the convention is doing politics in social movement organization and party politics in order to build a majoritarian bloc to change the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Hector. Another very interesting presentation that, again, I think think touches on some of the universals, you know, the issue of what Allende would probably have called the social force that gives life to the institutions of the state and of democracy is one there that we can see evident in the process in Chile. Now, before we go into the question and answer session, I had a couple of questions for our different panelists. And for Olivia, I think, you know, the main question that I had was really how far does the plurinational state that you discussed make a break with the previous constitutional projects in Bolivia, and how far has the Bolivian, the MAS government been able to create a plurinational state?
Yeah, shall I answer now? Yep. I think, yeah, that is a very good question. And I think one of the things that a lot of people have pointed out, and one of the things that sort of has been drawn out of some of, especially what you were saying, Victor, is that there is a sort of, seems to be some inherent contradiction in pursuing what might be seen or revolutionary change through a constitution, which is a kind of linchpin of liberal democracy. And on the one hand, and I think this was a tension that really, you know, was a struggle for the MAS and remains so, because I think the MAS pursued an emancipatory politics, sort of rewriting the constitution, instituting a policy of decolonization, engaging in this kind of campaign or a series of symbolic acts that intended to sort of address the racialized oppression, the economic exploitation of Bolivia's indigenous peoples. But by using this sort of framework of the liberal constitution, it also ends up sort of reifying or in some way sort of entrenching other modes of governance that can lead and have historically led to acts of violence. So liberal sort of conceptions of the rule of law in some ways, the role of the police, the military, for example, and therefore sort of excluding other forms of politics that might kind of actually give rise to a genuine plurinational state. I think in terms of sort of obstacles, I think one of the, a major sort of problem emerges in the divides that sort of the constitutional process gave rise to, particularly in terms of indigenous perceptions of the role of the state and the kind of the developmentalist vision of the MAS, which collided in many ways and continues to with its professed sort of commitment to buen vivir, suma que. And this is something that Rafael Bautista, the sort of a theorist of plurinationalism and a very prolific commentator at the moment, has kind of talked about, that it's precisely this kind of, the language of plurinationalism also therefore became a major problem for the MAS, because the further it departed from it, the easier it was for its opponents to kind of criticize from the left as well as from the right. So in many ways, the kind of the plurinational project also created many issues for the MAS, which was committed to a program of state capture, of economic redistribution that required the sort of organs of the state as conceived through a sort of the liberal mode of the constitution. Yeah, so I think, so there were a lot of tensions that emerged as a result of the constitutional process. And that's, yeah, made it very difficult to kind of realize what we might call a genuine plurinational state, but also because I think, as we've been saying, the constitution is a live document, it's a live sort of being. It requires political power to enforce. It also changes, it's situational to that degree.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that some of those issues that you point to there are kind of universal as well. The issue of, how we develop economically and what the relationship is between economic development and extractivism, for example, which I know has been very alive in Bolivia, and I'm sure will be a key issue that comes up in Chile as well. I don't know if we've had any questions in the chat, but before we move to that, I have a question for each of the other panelists as well. And for Lina, I know that you know, in the history of the 1991 process, there were some key personalities that played a crucial role in the development of the Constitution. And I wonder what you think about the importance of the individual in history, in the history of the development of constitutions, and what lessons there might be for other processes in the 1991 process.
Yes, Victor, this is a really interesting question because it's a collective plan. Change the constitution is definitely a collective plan, and is very important for the left and for the progressist allies, just to have an open mind to be there, to be part of the process, to participate, and just have the power to include the most important mechanisms, the most important elements into the constitution that will be transformed and will transform the situation of the previous situation that the country lived. Then for us, we had really important figures that not necessarily were part of the guerrilla members, for example, that they got, as I presented, they were 11 people from the guerrilla members. However, they had this really interesting process in which they supported the most serious and progressist lawyers in the country in order to go to these new mechanisms, the new constitutional mechanisms like the Constitutional Court. Then having this support, not from just the peers in the political party, not just the friends in the political party, but having the capacity to understand the need for the state and for a democratic moment, that definitely supported these figures and these important personalities that made an important change. Then, for example, in the Constitutional Court, we have 9 members, 9 very important lawyers that had a really important trajectory, not necessarily from the left, but very clear about this. And they changed for 10 years the legal life in Colombia. They transformed the idea of human rights. They transformed the idea of how they brought all the ideas from how to transform a really old society into a really interesting mechanisms to explore and to demand human, economic, social, political rights in Colombia. I think it's very interesting to see how support important and just other figures that not necessarily are the friends or just the peers, the normal people, and this how they can just promote these changes that the country needed.
Thank you. And I'm sure we'll get into this in the Q&A. Before we do, a final question from me for Hector, which is, to discuss, you were discussing the, I guess, the negotiations about the rules for the negotiation that will be the Constituent Assembly. And I think this points to the importance of how those rules are drawn up and how they will affect change. And so I wonder if you would hazard a prediction about how these rules will actually shape the aspirations that many people are embedding into the constitutional process.
Yeah, well, it's harder to make predictions because things are constantly change. But I think the idea that the quorum, which is 2/3, is a quite of standard measure. Also was part of the constitution, I think, in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. So it's not something like unreasonable. Of course, it's problematic because the rule was made by the agreement between some of the political parties, not all of them, a year before. And there's still unclear if the convention will discuss it or not. yesterday in the discussion, the quorum was incorporated. But I mean, so far I understand, tomorrow, some of the more radical sector of the conventional will propose an amendment to remove it. And we don't know what will happen with that vote, because it will depend basically from the moderate sector of the anti-neoliberal coalition, the Frente Amplio, to decide if the quorum will remain or not. But because the progressive forces have so much majority and the conservatives were reduced to less than a third, there is no way in the quorum by itself can be problematic or can be as a break of the possibilities of transformation. So that is the kind of empirical issue. And even though the reactionary sector within the convention can create a bigger coalition, they don't have simply the numbers. So the progressive majority is huge, and it has been quite cohesive in the way they are voting. So yesterday, despite of the discussion about the quorum, basically most of the rules passed with a huge majority. So I think that here is more a dilemma about between the political forces and the meaning of democracy that I try to explain, rather than a discussion about the real possibilities that the opposition have to stop the process of transformation. And I think that is important, particularly in some element of consensus. I think there is clear consensus that this convention and this constitution will be, will create an anti-neoliberal or post-neoliberal constitution that, as the case of Colombia and a little bit the case of Bolivia, will recognize equality, will recognize Chile as a plurinational, will recognize social rights. That is kind of consensus. So with the quorum or without the quorum, those elements probably will be part of the new constitution.
Thank you. Yeah, it kind of makes me wonder about the issue of national resources, but we'll come to that. We have some questions from the audience. I think the first question that we'll take is for Olivia. And the question, it's not clear whether it wants to be, whether the person wants to read it. I assume not, otherwise it should be indicated. So the question is, how did the potential contradictions between highland and lowland indigenous movements in Bolivia contribute to weakening the MAS or Evo Morales? Was a growing alienation of indigenous social movements from the state party apparatus an important contributor to enabling the coup?
Yeah, really good questions. Okay, so for the first one, I think, so firstly, I mean, the contradictions between highland and lowland indigenous movements, I think it can be seen as a product of sort of differing historical and political trajectories. Highland peasant indigenous groups have a different relationship with the state, have engaged much closely historically with the state. If we look at the Sasutsabe, the major peasant union federation, which is sort of kind of arose out of particularly sort of Aymara Campesino movement in the 60s and 70s. It all from the outset had a kind of a project of state transformation, or at least with state engagement. And that's kind of very different from the lowland indigenous groups, which then particularly in the 90s were I think very much empowered through the sort of the language of multiculturalism that emerged in that time, but had historically not engaged with the states or with kind of campesino union structures in the same way. So I think from the outset, the sort of the tensions between those movements, or sort of two wings of the movement, if you want to say, were certainly very important for the MAS, and a difficult task to sort of achieve a kind of reconciliation. And with specific reference to the Constituent Assembly, the MAS very from the outset was basically proclaimed the power of political parties as a way which then had the effect of limiting indigenous representation in the Constituent Assembly. And political parties were quite a decisive sort of element of the Constituent Assembly. But I mean, that was done for a reason, because the ultimate sort of aim was to kind of it was transformation of the state. And this was a kind of an effective way of doing that, but it does sort of show the kind of differing, differing kind of approaches to sort of dealing with the question of indigenous representation. So did that contribute to weakening the mass? I think in that specific moment around 2009, I wouldn't say yes, it did, because I think this was a tension the mass was able to reconcile. But I think it's certainly something in the past few years that has become increasingly more difficult, especially as sort of you've kind of got the expansion of kind of commodity extraction, which tends to fall in lowland areas, which has sort of generated greater conflict between the mass and between sort of lowland indigenous rights. Which I think then leads on to the second question, which was, the growing alienation of indigenous social movements from the state party apparatus. I think that's a really, really good question. I think absolutely the coup was made possible by a weakening, of the connection of the autonomy of indigenous and also sort of social movements more broadly in terms of the Sesut-Sebe and the COB, the major trade union federation, a kind of hollowing out of these organizations as autonomous organizations, a kind of a process of co-optation in many ways, which weakened the organizations, but also served to sort of, then when kind of 2009 happened, the mobilization, I think, was just not as strong, or was not as strong as it needed to be in order to avert the coup. And I think, therefore, what we see after in post Anya's dictatorship is a reaffirmation, is a kind of consolidation of the link between social movements and the mass, a sort of a changing, a sort of rebirth might be too strong, but a sort of basically the growing a reformation of the relationship, because absolutely I think that was a major problem, and I think certainly by the late years post the referendum in which Evo Morales chose to run, these created problems of legitimacy for between social movements and the state.
Yeah, I think several of the things you just discussed there point to this tension between social movements, political parties, and that issue of co-optation by the state. I think for any left-wing constitutional process is key, really. We have some other questions have come in. We've got a question from Bridget for Lina, and the question is the right to protest peacefully, included in the Constitution of Colombia? And if it is, why was this right overridden by the state with the violation of human rights during the recent protests there?
Thank you for the question. It's really interesting. Yes, it is included, is the Article 37, and definitely is included, like the right to protest peacefully and publicly. The problem will be the gap. Two different problems. One is the government, that is a right-wing political party, that definitely they don't believe in this is that will be the case on the streets in Colombia, and then they say basically they were not pacific and try to put just all kind of violence, using all kind of forces, and obviously disturbing the problem. And even they didn't recognize the process like a social process and a legitimate process. Then it's a question of a political perspective of this kind of protest. And for them, and one of the representatives of these political parties say, basically, this is not a right. This is not true. This is not the interpretation that you have to read from the Constitution. However, that's not true. The Constitution clearly states the right. And when the Inter-American Commission visited Colombia for this case, say the same, saying, yes, this is a right, and it's in the Constitution, and actually it's in the Inter-American Convention as well, then it's definitely no doubt in legal terms. The problem will be the gap with the mechanism to protect people in practice. And this is probably the problem that we have in all the countries with this kind of protests on the street, and is we don't have a mechanism to protect immediately the people and to limit and put some limits to the police, because this is in the hands of the government, and then it's not easy to manage this. Then they will have other resources to protect these people and to protect the people on the streets, but it's not a mechanism to avoid the violence from the police. This is the reality, is the gap between the legal stuff, the Constitution, the guarantees, and the practice. And this is unfortunately the big gap, and the lawyers trying to do their best, trying to put the mechanisms in practice for protecting these people. But actually it's an enormous problem that, as you saw on TV, basically in the news.
Yeah, I think that's a very clear answer. And it points to this fundamental issue, which is, the willingness to actually implement the measures that are embedded in constitutions and abide by the law. But there's another issue there, which is, who gets to decide which interpretation of the Constitution should prevail? Who gets to decide what is legitimate protest and what isn't? Many states, as we know, many constitutions contain articles relating to states of emergency, states of exception, which are meant to guide the state through periods of crisis, but obviously periods of deep socioeconomic trauma and the desire for change is a crisis for the state. So some important points there. We also have a question for Hector here. And the question is whether there is any tension between the movements on Chile's street, where many were talking of revolution during late 2019, and those driving the constitutional process within the existing system. This is a question from Bridget as well.
Thank you for the question. I think it is still unclear all the forces that were involved and the strategies and tactics that were imaginated by people during the uprising of 2019 is something that we are still trying to understand. Probably some sector and groups call for a more radical transformation, something like a revolution. But at least from the perspective of the key players, let's go to say the political parties, but also the union of social movements called Unidad Social, that was trying to coordinate the uprising a little bit, but also from the grassroots movement, I don't see a revolutionary fraction. There was agreement about the need for a constitutional change. There was agreement as well about recognition of human rights abuses. There was also the so-called social agenda, which was different demands about the minimum wage, for example, the guarantee of education, health, and so on. Some more radical sector was asking President Piñera to resign. But beyond that, I cannot perceive any significant and organized fraction calling for a revolution. I would say actually, in fact, most of the organization and movements were orientated to this kind of in and out strategy, which is quite of reformist, if you want to say it. So we're going to mobilize and then we're going to try to win election, or we mobilize and we're going to push institutions to deliver social change through direct negotiation with the executive, to direct confrontation and negotiation with political parties. Other element which is important to consider, of course, is part of the strategy was determined by the pandemic. Until March, we will have a second era of the uprising. We need to remember that the last big demonstration and mobilization in Chile was for the 8th of March, which was the the feminist mobilization. And if we remember, the biggest demonstration in Santiago gathered 1 million of people. The feminist movement that 8th of March gathering 2 million of people in the same city. So that was the trend. We don't know what will happen if we wouldn't have this pandemic, right? But probably things will be different, because I really believe that there was a really bottom-up process of organization. And we don't know if that process will be integrated fully in the convention as is happening right now. But of course, because we have the pandemic, that process of bottom-up organization and grassroots coordination on cabildos assemblies just stop, and it still survive, but is more attached to this like a in and out strategy of taking part in local election, taking part in the convention, support the convention within but outside, always combining this strategy of autonomy, but also incidence in institutional landscape. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great answer. I think there are several issues that have come up across all of your presentations. One of them, at least in Olivia's and Hector's, is the role of social movements and the key role that they've played in instigating the process of constitutional change, but also in visualizing what the constitution should look like and what the state should look like. And so I guess it's a question for all three of you. You know, how do you see the role of social movements in the respective countries that you're looking at in the future? And in Lina's case, what was the role of social movements in 1991? You've mentioned insurgencies and the student movement to a degree, but I wonder if there was, you know, a more organized social movement such as this Unidad Social in Chile or the MAS in Bolivia. And whoever would like to go first. Lina, I think maybe you.
Well, let me start then, because it's the old case. But yes, I think the social movement were really important, because behind in 1991, and has been, and not only that, it was the first moment they were very important, but actually for the following up, for the implementation of the Constitution, for all the possibilities that Colombia has had in the past, using the Constitution as a central tool for democratic opening. Definitely a social movement have been really essential and crucial. Then at that point, at the beginning of the 90s, they were involved in all kinds of campaigns of human rights. If you think at that point, the war in Colombia was terrible, and the human rights abuses, in particular from the state at that point, and the relationship between paramilitary groups and the state was the maximum point, was absolutely clear. And the massacres, the violence against political leaders, the massacres against the Unión Patriótica, the political parties from the left political parties, and other words, an intense campaign against human rights defenders and human rights in general. Then definitely they were struggling to be part in the political arena. It was very difficult for social movement because they were suffering the most of the war at that point, the conflict at that point. But they definitely were behind of the scene. They were part of this, just all the left, but not only, just organizations that they were behind. The feminists had a really important role there for the implementation of human rights, or the inclusion of human rights in the Constitution. Then I think they were not that clear, that visible, that for example, the student movement they were very visible, because they had a really intense campaign and very important university throughout the country doing a very important job. but definitely the human rights movement were suffering the conflict and being the first victims in line, and then they were behind working and struggling. And from that moment, they have been an important evolution of the social movement, and definitely the support of the rulings, being part of the mechanisms where the court has these mechanisms to, for example, to participate in the debates about a particular topic. For example, forced displacement, that is a very important issue. More than 9 million victims in a country, moving from the rural areas to the cities, all the cities, not only Bogota, the capital, but all the cities. This is a huge, enormous problem that the Constitutional Court had to reorganize and rethink and say, okay, government come here, okay, Congress come here, okay, judicial system come here, what are we doing for this? And then the civil society were behind of all this process, always thinking, always proposing, always organizing things, never stop. And I think that's why we have a very dynamic civil society organizations, and that definitely we all as a society have a really important, well, to say thank you and to the social movement, because they have leaded the process, the most difficult process in these decades.
Thank you. Hector, Olivia?
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
I can go first.
Go on, Hector, you go first, and then Olivia, sorry.
Yeah, I think I agree with Lina. For the case of Chile, also social movement play a fundamental role. But here it's important to understand that the convention by itself is not the old expression of the process of changing constitution. I think from the end of 80s, even during the dictatorship, there was a movement that opposed the Pinochet constitution. That movement was still alive during 90s, 2000, 2010s. It became massive and makes much more sense during the different uprising of social movements. For example, during the student movement of 2006, one of the key conclusions was, well, to achieve free education and to consider education as a social right, we need to change the constitution. The same happened with other kind of movements that add new meanings and point out the need and necessity to change the constitution. So, of course, movements cooperate, creating the environment. Also during the uprising social movements and also this bottom-up organization start to debate the constitution. There were these autonomous cabildos that people just organized, moving between barricades, streets, and community organizing, that start to debate the constitution and start to think what kind of constitution we want. So, and that happened before the convention. So the challenge of the convention actually is incorporate those demands, those elaboration, those meanings, and those view about the country in a formal process and an institutional process. Of course, this process of integration is a little bit problematic because on one side, the convention came from this agreement between the political parties without participation of social movements and the people on the street. So that is problematic. The quorum is about that. The debate on the quorum is exactly about that problem, but also have the challenge, of course, to keep incorporating those sectors in the institution that requires, by definition, open a little bit the process itself. And I think so far we can see that through the commissions, the convention had managed to establish a really close relationship with civil society. Social movement have participated in the public audience of all the commissions, and that means recognize what they have done before to change the constitution, but also to include different mechanisms of participation of social movement. So I think social movement will keep playing a significant role. The key question is if those social movements will be capable to become a political movement. That probably happened in the case of Colombia, probably happened in the case of Bolivia, which require a different level of organization and a national view of the country, not just in relation to the constitution, but also, for example, to the possibility to hold a government, majority in parliament, and create this block that we need to transform the country.
Yeah, and I think, this is one of the issues that was, I guess, resolved to some degree, although with limitations in Bolivia, because it's how do you, social movements can drive a process, as Lina and Hector have described, but then how are they institutionalized? Does it have to be through the mechanism of political parties, or can a constitution recognize social movements as actors within a set of institutions themselves? So, Olivia.
Yes. So to reiterate, I think as you've both said, I mean, social movements clearly were instrumental in the forging of the constitution in Bolivia. It had been a historic demand of social movements. And I think, this was because obviously the constitution was seen as a corrective, as an opportunity to refound Bolivia, to include the indigenous social movements. But I think, as we see in 2019, it shows us that with the coup, it shows us that constitution really only acquires meaning when it's actually enforced, or when it's actually got the power of social movements perhaps behind it. Because if we see in the dictatorship, it wasn't the rule of law that saw Bolivia overcome the dictatorship. It wasn't even representative democracy. In many ways, we saw the failure utterly of representative democracy, with the mass resignations of the assembly members under total political crisis. So that sort of also shows us that a constitution, it requires institutional strength in order to be enforced. And I think that there's a question in the chat which was about can a constitution do anything to prevent a coup, as happened in Bolivia, which I think sort of links on to this, because I think it was really only the kind of remobilization of social movements in the wake of the coup, in the wake of a crisis also internally within the mass. So, general strikes called by the COB, road blockades by the Sasut-Sabay, which were designed to engineer fresh elections, which is also kind of interesting when you sort of see it. In many ways it's quite a limited demand. It's simply making an appeal to sort of representative democracy. So I think, so I think obviously constitutions require institutional sort of backing, but also I guess we're sort of talking about social movements as kind of as a sort of slightly homogenous sort of force. But social movements are of course deeply divided in their approach to the state, to constitutions. And again, that was sort of brought out in the kind of in Bolivia, and in the formation of the constitution, but also in the kind of recovery of democracy post-coup in 2019. So I think, a constitution obviously cannot prevent a coup, but it requires it requires itself to be made real by the social movements who are defending it.
I wonder if the other panelists have any thoughts on whether a constitution can prevent a coup, or perhaps repressive excesses by a government. Lina?
Yes, I have an idea. I like to say a particular point from the discussion that we had just before, and it was the political opportunities that this process definitely provokes in practice. A good example in Colombia is one of the members of the student movement that promoted the Constitution 1991 is the current mayor of Bogota. And this is a no minor thing. She was a student in 1991, and now she's the mayor. And this is important. She said, she described herself from the center, sometimes from the center right, and we believe her. But basically, this is a political opportunity, no doubt at all. The other, with respect to I think it's probably my response to the preventing the CAP or other, violence or other type of violence is probably very legalistic. And I'm a lawyer, then obviously I only think in this way, but it's definitely not. I don't think the constitutions or just the law, the framework can avoid practical issues. However, I definitely believe in the mechanisms to ensure that these things can be dealt in the best way possible. Because obviously the violence is the violence, and you cannot avoid practical actions against the government. But if you are the opposition, if you live in the other side and you really never had access to the power, for example, that's the Colombian case, definitely the Constitution has to have the guarantees that all the political parties have the opportunity to participate. Because this is exactly the debate. The left wing in Colombia never had the real political participation and action and possibility to participate in the real way, to introduce the changes that we need. Then for me, the answer is the most important for a constitution is to provide mechanisms for participation and for the participation of all the sides in the political spectrum.
Thank you, Lina. Hector, any thoughts on that point?
Yes, well, my short answer is no. Of course, any constitution can prevent a coup. Actually, constitution can be devising and trigger some coup. I think in the case of Bolivia, it's quite clear that the constitution was used as an argument to put pressure on Evo Morales and his effort to change its own constitution to be re-elected. So that is a tough example of how a constitution also can trigger or give conditions on argument to orchestrate a coup. In the case of Chile, I think the question is also interesting because, of course, to defend democracy, we need popular mobilization. But some sector on the left right now consider that there is not such a power to defend institution by itself. So if we polarize the institutional landscape at a point that can be break, the reactionary forces can be just as destructive as they were during the Pinochet coup. So, and the people is not prepared to defend against that attack. I think the example of Bolivia is a good one because, as Olivia said, people went on the street to defend democracy and defend the constitution and defend all the legal framework as a way to recover the power. A lot of people in Chile doubt that something like that is possible in the case of Chile. Although we have this big demonstration of popular force, but because it wasn't organized in a national movement, we doubt about the capability of the social movement to defend. So that explains why a sector of the left are defending the quorum. They basically say, well, if we lost democracy, we're going to lose the entire process, and we don't going to have any chance to re-win because we cannot trust fully in our own capacities. So the Constitution also gives some room to stabilize the process without avoiding any radical polarization. It's not the argument I fully believe, but I think it's a good angle to ask about this question, because I think because the right wing now lost most of the representation in the convention and can lose also the election at the end of the year. There is a possibility, not necessarily of a coup, but also a significant counter-reaction that, of course, will not respect institutional means.
Yeah, that's a frightening prospect, I think. And I think one of the things you're referring to there is a tension in any negotiation, really, which is between, you know, maximalist demands or minimalist demands that are based on an assessment of the relative strengths of the different parts. And I think what Lina was saying there about participation of all of the different groups, effectively ensuring that the different groups involved buy into the process, is a key part of any consensus-based constitution. I think it's slightly different if, like in Nicaragua in 1979, you have utterly defeated your enemies, and then you have, you know, they had a 1979 constitution, and then they later developed another one in 1987, or a similar thing with the Cuban case. But in the cases of the countries that we're discussing, these are really states that are, if anything, you know, they're on a spectrum, and they're transitioning or they could embody a transition. The other issue that I found really interesting was one that was really raised by Olivia in her talk, which is, you know, the concepts of a nation is itself, as Benedict Anderson talked about, you know, it's an imagined community. So that but yet you have different experiences within that community. And those different experiences can be related to gender, of course, race, whether you're indigenous or mestizo, highland, lowland, urban, rural, and so on. And I think that these different experiences then create and allow the creation of social coalitions which form and reform over time. And one of the tensions of any social movement, as Olivia correctly pointed out, you know, there's no such thing as a united social movement. There is just, you know, they are disaggregated in many ways, ideologically and politically and so on. But one of the challenges is how you constantly keep what Gramsci, I guess, would call a hegemonic bloc for change. And I think this is a tension for the left in any constitutional process, whether it's you know, at the beginning, as in Chile's case, or in maturity in the case of Colombia and Bolivia. But another issue that we haven't really had time to touch on today, not directly anyway, is the role of the military and of the we talked about institutions indirectly, but clearly this is something that is coming up in the debates in Chile today. The role of carabineros, should it be refounded even, you know, and called something else? And I know that there were discussions around this during the Colombian peace process. So I think, you know, perhaps that's a more traditional concern of the left with regard to constitutions, but governing the checks and balances on the exercise of coercion is another key issue. And while, as Lina points out, that can't just be legalistic, and the Bolivian experience shows that social force, if correctly mobilized, if actively mobilized, can actually enforce certain rules, even on the military, it's still something that I think is important. I'm afraid that we've come to the end of our time, and I really wish we hadn't, because, you know, I know that all three of you had many more interesting things to say, and each of these cases is by itself worth an entire discussion. So maybe that's something for Alborada to consider in future. But I'd like to thank you for your presentations. I'd like to thank the audience for their questions and for their attention to this issue, and to Alborada for organizing this event. For those of you that want to stay on, I think there will be a little bit of music for the next 10 minutes or so. If you were enjoying vibing out on the tunes earlier on, you're welcome to stay. But otherwise, good night and thank you very much.